So today I'm going to talk about platforming, which involves creating a context in which a person's speech is taken more seriously or enjoys a kind of halo of worthiness, or in which the person's able to do speech acts of certain kinds more effectively. No platforming policies come up in the national press every couple of months. Most recently, Gavin Williamson has presented a bill to Parliament that would make viewpoint selective no platforming policies impermissible on university campuses. I'm going to start by talking about what I think is involved when in platforming a person's speech and the decision to intervene and elevate a person's speech in the relevant way. I'll say a little bit about accountability and how I think this relates to deplatforming protests, which are protests that seek to have someone's invitation to speak at an event withdrawn. The sort of mainstay of this talk is going to be an argument I'm presenting as to what I think the focus or the objective of platform distribution policies should be. So in the existing literature, and I think in the public consciousness, the public awareness of no platforming policies, I think the focus is mostly on no platforming policies as a way of preventing harm being done by certain kinds of privileged speech. I'm going to suggest instead we should think of the objective as trying to improve the conditions of the epistemic and political ecosystem overall. And at the end, I'm going to sketch briefly what I think such a policy would look like, and I will call it affirmative platforming policy. So to start with, what is a platform? So the most typical examples that we hear about are speaking engagements at university unions, debating societies, and universities. Other examples might be opportunities to speak on television or columns in newspapers, things like that. We might sometimes hear, Twitter and Facebook and things being described as platforms. They are in the sense that they elevate people's speech in certain ways, but they're also technological platforms, and we should try and distinguish the two senses there. Twitter is a platform in the same way Uber is a platform. It's a piece of technology upon which speech can be conducted or upon which commerce can be conducted. But that's distinct from the role of a platform in speech in particular. So as I intend it, a platform is a vehicle by which certain privileges are conferred on speech. So a platform is strictly speaking a situation or a context in which speech is put by a platform provider. So a platform does the key job of elevating the speech of a speaker above other people's speech or above the sort of general level of conversation at which most people's speech is conducted. So we think about a few of the privileges that get conferred on speech. Neil Levy gives an account of the meta-epistemic cues we rely on to understand or to make sense of a lot of the claims we don't really have context for. To understand whether a claim is credible, if I don't know enough, I have to see, well, is it getting taken credible as people who are better epistemically situated than I am? And Levy argues that invitations to prestigious platforms is one of these meta-epistemic cues that creates higher order evidence that a position is credible or is to be taken seriously. In political life, we see platforms fulfilling a number of roles. So in one sense, they're vehicles for shares in the attention economy. Insofar as when I was invited to speak at the joint session, the organizers of the joint session are the ones providing the audience. They're giving me shares in the attention economy. Smith and Archer give quite a good account of what these shares in the attention economy do. So in addition to giving me an opportunity to persuade you all, shares in the attention economy let people set an agenda. So they can determine what is worth agreeing on or disagreeing on as part of this epistemic community. They also let us establish the common ground for our epistemic or our political community. One piece of common ground we might want to establish is what does the community look like and what is involved in membership of this community. When we determine things like this, we do, I think, largely intersubjectively, we're exercising hermeneutical power. Hermeneutical power is the ability to create social meaning or shared meaning. And Cody presents, I think, a persuasive argument that in a lot of key contexts, hermeneutical power is zero sum. So where there is a disagreement over whether what some institution means or what its boundaries are, say marriage or the citizenry, the one group of people are only capable of succeeding in making social meaning a particular way by causing the people they disagree with to be unsuccessful. So in that sense, the actual exercise of hermeneutic power is zero sum. What does this tell us? Well, firstly, platforms seem to be vehicles for a relational good which is rivalrous. That is to say, to extend it to one person prevents you from extending it to someone else. They're not shareable in that sense. If we take the key, a common example, BBC Question Time is the BBC's flagship debate programme. There are 5 chairs on every episode, 4 of which are given over to the dominant political parties, and 1 of which is left over for someone who's not a politician. If the BBC invites an economist to that seat, they are not inviting a poet or a political scientist or a journalist or someone who can give other perspectives. So in that sense, it's rivalrous. It's a distribution choice. They're distributing something scarce. We might want to say look, if we're having trouble with the distribution of platforms, what we should do is create more platforms. This is, I think, something we can do in some contexts, but we have to bear in mind that by creating more platforms, what we're going to wind up doing in a lot of the cases is diluting the efficacy of each platform. So again, if we're giving people more shares in the attention economy, if we're creating more shares in the attention economy, what we're giving each person is a smaller share. And to the extent that we can give people more opportunities to engage in social meaning making, it's still going to be zero sum if there's a disagreement as to what some institution means. So we can create more vehicles for these sort of rivalrous goods, but the goods remain rivalrous. It just means that the vehicles can be smaller amounts of them. So what we don't get away from is this sort of distribution choice. So what I want to look at is when a platform provider decides to involve themselves in another person's speech, elevate that speech in a relevant way, they seem to be making a choice about how they distribute something scarce. I think a couple of things are implied by this. The first is that a no platforming policy fails to elevate certain people's speech, but it doesn't prevent people's speech. It doesn't seem to make them less able to engage in the sort of common speech that most of us do that's not privileged. So if there is a complaint that a person's speech has been disregarded, or for instance, their free speech is in some sense disrespected, sometimes this does seem to suggest that the person had a claim on this particular platform in this particular context. And at least in the public discussion around no platforming policy, that burden of proof doesn't seem to be met very often. What I think is a more interesting complaint is where there are groups of people who are just systemically left out of access to platforms. They just don't get their share in the attention economy, and they don't get their share of hermeneutical power. I think this is true, this is important, and we're going to come to it a little bit later. But for now, it's worth pointing out that even where this is the case, it's not going to be obvious which individual member of that group was entitled to a platform in which individual case. So we're thinking about the distribution question, rather than saying, is it legitimate to have a no platforming policy or some other platform distribution policy? The question that platform distributors face is much more simple. It's how do I distribute my platform well? In virtue of what should I elevate this speech rather than that speech? And when we start looking at that question, I think we get a more interesting set of policy options out. So very briefly, what that seems to indicate is that whatever reasons a platform distributor has for distributing their platform, they're going to wind up being responsible for the distribution they make. The motivating reasons will be good in probably most cases. I don't think there's widespread bad faith action here. But what it means is that responsibility for this decision is probably unavoidable. Very briefly, I want to indicate, I think there's probably also accountability owed to particular groups. So in typical cases, so think about student union, where the members of the debates convener or something for the student union invites people to speak at a show debate. They seem to be acting on behalf of the membership. And so when we have deplatforming protests, so that is protests where students call on their union to withdraw an invitation, it does seem to be a group of people calling on a designated actor who's acting on their behalf, saying, well, we think you made the wrong decision, please make a different decision. So in student unions, I think that's probably a straightforward example of accountability. This doesn't apply in all other cases. So national broadcasters don't act on the behalf of citizenry in the same way, and students are not members of their universities in the same way they're members of their unions. That said, Simpson and Srinivasan have, I think, a persuasive argument as to why universities should pay a lot of attention to what undergraduate and postgraduate students think about how that kind of academic gatekeeping goes on. But very briefly, I think we don't want only members or only the sort of in-group to have standing to protest when distributions are made. Insofar as platforms are vehicles for hermeneutic power and various other sorts of privileges, they make platform people more effective members of the political and epistemic community, people more able to engage in social meaning making, for instance. And to the extent that one person is made a more powerful member of the community, I think we can make a fairly straightforward argument that accountability is owed to all of us for that. So having outlined sort of the preliminaries there, let's look a little bit in more detail at the core argument. So I'll go through the existing literature a little bit and focus in on what I think is an interesting trend. So rather than preventing harm, which I think is the commonplace justification for no platforming policies, what I'm going to suggest is we want our platform distribution policies to improve the overall political and epistemic ecosystem in which those platforms are situated. So Neil Levy's argument is that we have good reason not to platform certain kinds of speech if platforming that speech would make misleading higher order evidence come into existence that suggests that a view is credible or indeed is not credible. The harm of this, the harm of creating this evidence, is that individual doxastic agents might start to form false beliefs. So again, we have a sort of individual harm being observed here, which I think is quite tangible and quite correct. I think Fuller gives a more detailed description of this in the political sphere when she talks about the way dreamers, who are residents of the USA who don't have certain legal documentation but can defer being deported for certain periods of time. When certain kinds of speech act are carried out pertaining to dreamers, it can cause emotional distress, it can cause feelings of worthlessness, and dreamers might come to doubt that they really are an accepted member of the larger campus community. So what this affects is a class, but the harm that comes about is still expressed in individual cases. Now, I don't want to suggest that these authors are committed to an exclusively individual reading of their view. I don't think that's what they intended. What I do think is that is the way they're most commonly going to be understood, and I do think that's how no platforming policies are understood in the public. They're understood as a way of preventing individuals from being harmed by certain kinds of privileged speech act. What I want to suggest is that our policy should try and target how we can improve the epistemic ecosystem overall and improve the political ecosystem overall. So rather than preventing individual harm, we want to kind of garden the environments to make it overall better. So thinking about the role platforms play, they make some speech more effective and make some people more capable of setting an agenda or establishing the common ground. So Fuller refers to Langton's work, which I think is helpful here. According to Langton's argument, women are silenced when various speech acts make women as a class that does not have standing to engage in certain elocutions. Who gets to engage in certain elocutions is determined intersubjectively. So the speech that makes a class of people not have standing is one of these exercises of hermeneutic power. It's one of these common ground establishing speech acts. Platform speech, which gets to establish the common ground, can affect the standing of various groups of people, and it can also disestablish some common ground. If a group of member of societies, a group in society's membership is called into question, we can have a debate about whether this group is properly involved and properly a member of society. But even if we agree at the end of the debate that they are, their membership is no longer taken to be granted. It's now to be proved and not just assumed. What this does, I think, is subordinate the group and mean that the intersubjective determinations about who this community is are ones in which this group's membership is at least in question. I think there's a relevant sense then that platform speech doesn't make it just the case that people doubt they're full and proper members of the community. It makes it the case that they're not full and proper members in the same way. So I think this is how the political ecosystem is altered by privileged speech in a way that is upstream of a lot of the individual harms. So we see largely the same shift in epistemology. So Levy tells us that creating misleading higher order evidence by platforming, for instance, an anti-vaxxer, is therefore also a signal that the speaker's dissent from the scientific consensus cannot be explained away as incompetence or insincerity. Because it certifies that we cannot dismiss their dissent on these grounds, the signal increases its epistemic significance and thereby increases the pressure to conciliate. So what this does when certain kinds of anti-vax position, to take an example, are platformed is create a circumstance in which we start looking for what is the relevant or the kernel of truth in the theory. So rather than simply consigning a theory to the outre if it is not supported by evidence, or if it is based on deliberately mishandling evidence, instead there's this pressure to try and figure out, well, what is the genuine contribution here? Because people better epistemically situated than us are taking it seriously. What this does is produce a kind of epistemic pollution, as Levy calls it, which he talks about in a few other contexts. So he also talks about imposter professional bodies, which can offer propaganda under the guise of a scientific consensus or under the guise of education. So what we have is a focus emerging on political and epistemic ecosystems, which probably can't be easily disentangled from each other, but which are really, really important to a lot of our public epistemology and our political theory. And I think the harms to these ecosystems in particular are what we should be focusing on when we talk about platform distribution policies. So in addition to trying to avoid individual harms, what we want to do is make sure that the ecosystem in which individuals rely on and in which these harms take place is one that is supported or is made more healthy by the use of our platform distribution policies. And then there's two reasons I'll present for this at the moment. Firstly, I think if we're trying to prevent instances of harm, we will be unsuccessful in a lot of cases. We're not going to prevent all of them. Firstly, because policies will not always be effective. Secondly, because there will be some bad faith actors. So some people are going to not comply with policies or try and get away with not complying with policies. And sometimes good faith actors will make mistakes. So platform providers will just make the wrong judgment and they will elevate the wrong kind of speech sometimes. So I think trying to target that means we can maybe reduce the number of instances of harm overall, but we're not going to be able to wipe it out entirely. Secondly, and more importantly, even if harm prevention was entirely effective, we stopped 100% of cases of harm, the same epistemic and political harms are still likely to occur through other means. So platforms are one of a number of important vehicles in political and epistemic life, but they're not the only ones. Hate speech, various other kinds of subordinate speech, And just meta-epistemic cues like a deep voice and an RP accent all cause other sorts of subordination to occur. Disinformation is still going to spread on WhatsApp and Facebook. So what we're not going to be able to do is prevent these harms entirely. What we can do, however, is use platforms to try and improve the epistemic ecosystem and improve the political ecosystem in a way that is resilient to those forces. What this means, I think, sometimes is equipping marginalized social identities with the tools required to resist subordination. So if a platform is a vehicle for shares in the attention economy and for meaning-making power, it's important that people who are at risk of being cast out of the community in the way Fuller talked about are able to intervene and influence the political ecosystem and change what membership of the community means into something that doesn't subordinate or remove them. If we want our platform distribution policies to improve the epistemic and political ecosystem, we'll prevent a lot of cases of harm. We're going to be unlikely in most cases to platform or elevate speech that we think is going to do harm to individuals, because a lot of the time that's the same speech that does harm to the ecosystem. But sometimes what we've got to acknowledge is that in order to benefit the ecosystem overall, we have to platform some speech that is harmful in some individual cases. So the way we hold people to account if they're in power is often by putting them on a platform in which they can be scrutinized. However, putting them on that platform gives them an opportunity to lie to millions of people at a time, and to propagandize and to make social meaning. We have to make a judgment as to whether scrutiny is worthwhile in each individual case. But if we're simply trying to prevent any cases of harm, we wouldn't be allowed to platform people who are going to engage in this sort of bad faith epistemic behavior, which is unhelpful, because sometimes those are the people who are in power, and those are precisely the people we need to scrutinize. So far, what I've argued is that the decision lies with the platform provider whose speech they're going to intervene in and whose speech they're going to elevate. And I think platforms play a particularly important role in our political and epistemic communities that allow us to compose what the community looks like, what are the rules and the norms for the epistemic ecosystem. And this really important role means we've got a lot of, we have very good reason to try and use these platforms to improve the ecosystems we rely on, rather than simply avoiding individual harms to individual people. What I'm going to do for the remainder is very briefly sketch what I think this kind of policy would look like. So if we're trying to answer the question, how would I distribute my platform? How would I, whose speech do I want to intervene in? The conventional way of doing this is to say, well, I have an event, I'm going to put on a show debate, we need 6 speakers. So we'll think about who could we get, who's likely to answer our call, and we'll descend that list until we've filled all the chairs. We'll invite the first person, they say no, we'll invite the second person. I think the policy I'm suggesting would have basically 2 alterations to this. The first would be to begin with a discussion about what the platform is for. What are we trying to achieve with this? If it's a show debate, it's probably trying to achieve something theatrical. It's part of the social life of an organization like a student union. It's not really an epistemic endeavor. Whereas if we're trying to engage in an epistemic endeavor, we invite a different kind of guest. We're not going to invite people who put on a good show and contribute to the social life of the union. We invite experts in the field who are going to like cut to the meat of the issue in a way that's probably a bit more dry and technical. So those kind of decisions start off by telling us this is in virtue of what we think speech should be elevated. And importantly, I think this has to be negotiated with members of a union, if this is if invitations are being issued on members' behalf. And I think it has to be negotiated with the community more widely. So this is where the accountability comes in. So this first step is a negotiation as to what we think this particular platform is for. And everyone who's distributing a platform has to do this themselves. Platforms will all serve different functions. The second step involves ranking the people you're going to invite in order of preference. If the first person says no, we'll invite the second. The way you come to this ranking in accordance with an affirmative platforming policy is to think about what you want the platform to achieve, and that's what's going to tell you in virtue of what you're going to elevate speech. So whose speech is most worth privileging given the negotiation we came to in the first stage of this policy. So all told, what does this look like? I think a platform provider, given they have to make a decision as to whose speech they're going to get involved in and elevate, probably has some reason to try and find some kind of policy to support that. It will be difficult to avoid at least forming into certain habits when one does this over and over again. It's best to have a policy that can facilitate it. And I think a policy that is trying to improve the conditions of the epistemic and political ecosystems is probably more attractive than a policy that's trying to prevent any instances of harm for a number of reasons. Most importantly, what this does is equips the people who are most vulnerable in the current epistemic and political ecosystem and allows them to avoid subordination and defend themselves in the future. It equips people with the tools required to recognize conspiracy theories and the mishandling of evidence more often. So when they're in the epistemic ecosystem, even if it is highly polluted, they can deal with that pollution more effectively. I think these kind of objectives are probably going to be more effective and will give us a better set of outcomes from our platform distribution policies. And so far as there is a wide public discussion around no platform policies at the moment, I think this might actually encourage a better public conversation about epistemic justice and about standards of evidence in general. That's maybe a bit of a long shot. So I will look forward to the Q&A below, and I shall see you all there.